Hi, welcome to Expressions. I'm Julie Robbins. The Philbrook Museum of Art in Tulsa has many beautiful paintings, and tonight we're going to see a collection of some European paintings from the National Museum of Art of Romania. So stay tuned for your chance to see these rarely seen masterpieces when Expressions returns. Start the show off in the introductory gallery of the Philbrook Museum of Art, and here to tell us about the exhibition is Richard Townsend. Richard, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you.
Well, tell us about this beautiful exhibition.
Well, Old Masters Brought to Light is 27 paintings from the National Museum of Art of Romania in Bucharest. The first time these paintings have ever been seen in the Western Hemisphere, their first tour of the United States, and they have just been, as the title suggests, brought to light through conservation, and then they're touring, as I say, America for the first time, and exposing people from all over this country to these little-known, rarely seen masterworks that have, until recently, been hidden behind the Iron Curtain. The strength of the collection is the Italian school, and we have the earliest Italian painting in this exhibition right here. It's by Domenico Veneziano, from about 1435. Domenico was an extremely important painter in early Florence, even though he's from Venice, as his name indicates.
Right.
And he knew the great early innovators in Renaissance painting and sculpture. He knew Donatello, Ghiberti, the two sculptors, and of course Masaccio was really the most important painter in early 15th century Florence, and was responsible for introducing concepts of space, volume, and let me show you how this works or is reflected in a painting such as this Madonna and Child by Domenico Veneziano. These innovations in the early 15th century are quite clear here, clearly depicted here. You have the Madonna seated with the Christ child on her lap. Notice that even though the paint's darkened a bit, you can see how the figure of Madonna appears to us to be fully dimensional. I mean, she has weight.
Right.
You know, you see how the drapery describes her knees, the mass of her torso. So there is that sense of being fully formed, of having volume, of having that there is depth in this picture. So the idea of setting, putting figures into a naturalistic setting and making them believable, that's what the Renaissance is about, is admirably achieved here. And then notice how the figures themselves are formed, or how their flesh is modeled. I mean, there's almost a sculptural quality. There's a monumentality to the Christ. He almost looks like an ancient Greek or Roman sculpture. And that's another important element to the Italian Renaissance, is they're looking back at the sculpture of ancient Greece and Rome, and that influencing them in how they portrayed the figure naturally, partially clothed, with a grandeur, and also a naturalism. Now, on the other hand, in another city in Italy, about 50 or 60 years later, we have a painting by Antonello da Messina. It's in this painting that we have this new technique called oil painting being used. Now, what does oil painting allow? Well, the earlier medium of tempera involves the color, your pigment, and egg yolk, which it's suspended in, which is its vehicle, and it dries very quickly. You can't do a lot of work. Oil painting, if you've ever taken, amateur painting classes, you know that with oils, they take forever to dry. It's the color suspended in linseed oil, or another can be walnut oil, if you, depending on. But at any rate, in oil. And the oil, because it's slow drying, allows you to manipulate, to change, and because it's transparent and dry, it doesn't dry so fast, you can put layers and achieve a different sense of
like
the building up. Yeah, depth. And this is exactly what we have here. And notice how Antonello then creates, as you pointed out, Julie, a depth, and there's also a wonderful atmospheric quality. I mean, you have the background, which is, by the way, even though this depicts a scene from the scriptures,
right,
the crucifixion of Christ, he sets it in Sicily. That's the Bay of Messina, and with the little ships and people going in and out of buildings and churches. There's this wonderful little slice of life in the background there. Antonello makes it real for us, puts a remote, ancient event in a domestic, or a familiar, I should say, setting, makes it comfortable for us, makes the experience real for us. And we talked about a private devotional painting right there with the Antonello. This is a public devotional painting. In other words, this was to be seen in a public setting, a church. And in fact, this wonderful painting by Jacopo Bassano, he painted a number of these types of paintings as altarpieces. This would have been placed directly over an altar table, and this shows the further evolution now that the Venetians have this wonderful medium of oil paint. And look at the wonderful manner in which this is painted, with the building up of the oil paint with the different glazes, we call it, from one sort of red with a lighter red and then a white highlight on top, and you have a building up of the paint surface and thus Venetian artists like Bassano, like Titian, like Veronese achieved a luminosity. And this is by Nozadella, a very little known artist, but still I think one of the best parts of this exhibition from Romania is that it's not necessarily the major names, it's the byways, not necessarily the highways of art, that this collection explores, that these things really come to life. The best paintings, I think, in the show are by artists we don't necessarily know, or that aren't household names. And this painting by Nozadella is a prime example. The colors are brighter, but notice how the figures are more crowded, and they're pressed up against the picture plane. It becomes almost like a tapestry effect, where there's no background, like even in the Bassano that we looked at in the Crucifixion, with a landscape and the sky, and none of that really is a factor here. You have these figures that are sort of woven, as I say, referring back to that tapestry analogy. They're woven together, they're sort of linked. You know, the Madonna here, and the child, and then this is St. Catherine, and of course St. Joseph. But she looks out this way, the St. Catherine looks in another direction, the Christ child looks up. So there are the gestures and the glances of the figures all go in different directions, so it's sort of diffuse and very complicated. Well, this is a style called maniera, mannerism. And it was so called because it is mannered. It's sort of highly artificial, this composition. And this was a development later in the 16th century that prized complex and highly brilliant, as you can see, but complex, very erudite subject matter, complex compositions. The end result of this was to really alienate, unfortunately, the everyday viewer. And there was to be a reform. There was to be a dramatic change in Italian art that we will discuss in the next gallery.
Well, Richard, this looks to me like a Madonna and Child. Why don't you tell me about this one?
Well, that's right, but it's sort of interesting in that if you didn't know, if you hadn't just said that this is a sacred subject of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, you might think it was just an everyday
painting
scene, of a mother nursing. And that's the really wonderful point point I want to make about this painting. It's by Orazio Gentileschi. His painting spoke to the direct experience of the viewer. And I think you can see that very much in this painting by Orazio Gentileschi. The figure is pushed to the foreground. There's not a lot of background. It's dark. The background is neutral or dark. And then you have this dramatic light that hits across the two figures and sort of allows the figures to jump out at us. Also, the colors are brilliant. It engages our senses. This is what the reform of Italian art by Caravaggio and his followers, like Orazio here, was all about. It was about taking that mannered painting, that painting by Nozzadella, that was complex, hard to read, beautiful certainly, but didn't speak to one's direct experience, and transforming that into a painting that did. And this was so that the Catholic Church could convince the viewer in this period of great change. This was the period of the Protestant Reformation and the Roman Catholic Church's counter-Reformation. It was to ensure that they retained those who were faithful, kept them in the fold, and then to bring back those that had strayed. And it was through paintings such as this that spoke to our everyday experience that they were able to do that in part. Julie, about 40 years later, this painting was created by a fellow named Pietro da Cortona. Cortona here depicts the miraculous apparition of the Virgin and Child, you see in the upper left
sure
there,
does.
to St. Francis of Assisi, still known and loved today for his simplicity, his piety, his love for animals. He was a most Christ-like of men, and thus an important saint in the Counter-Reformation, in the Church's response to the Protestants in the North. But this exemplifies the drama, the theater, the energy of the High Baroque in Rome. After the first few decades of the 17th century, after Caravaggio's influence wanes, you have a new style, an emphasis on those qualities I just mentioned that it was more extroverted painting, a more exciting painting, and this was to celebrate the Roman Catholics' triumph, the triumph of Christianity and Roman Catholicism. The imagery of Francis, as I was saying, in this period of the Italian Baroque was extremely important and highly charged. And this was an appropriate moment to explore this theme, because we have here a recent acquisition by the Philbrook Museum of Art, a painting by Bernardo Strozzi, who was a painter in the city of Genoa, northwest coast of Italy. And we decided that was at the same time as having these wonderful Italian Baroque paintings from the National Museum of Romania to organize a small in-focus exhibition surrounding this recent acquisition of Philbrook's, and to not only reunite the painting with the drawing that that is related to it, and this is on loan to us from the J. Paul Getty Museum, but also to take a closer look at what Francis, what St. Francis, his image, represented in the 17th century, how the church and artists used this image to combat the Protestant heresy.
He was such a strong figure.
Exactly. Well, and as I said, being the most Christ-like of men, he was the perfect example. He was the example that that the church wanted people to use. The perfect role model.
Right.
At any rate, one of the exciting elements of this exhibition is to be able to look at the drawing by Bernardo Strozzi, which is one of the few drawings that survived by the artist, and to be able to compare it, as you can see, to the Tulsa painting here. And you can see how, this is a page from his sketchbook, how he works up very carefully the face of the saint in chalk. And that sort of prepares us for the great realism, the believability expressed in the painting, which results from the drawing. And related to it in this exhibition, as we look at images of St. Francis in Italian Baroque art, this by Guido Reni, who was a painter in Bologna, which quite a distance down the peninsula, Italian peninsula, from Genoa. And nevertheless, there is a similar emphasis on St. Francis as a devout man, as a person who with his rosary here, adores the crucifix in a similar, not completely identical manner. Strozzi's more extrovert and dramatic. Guido Reni's painting here, in keeping with the way he was as an artist, I mean, his outlook on life.
It's very soft.
Soft and elegant and quieter. Nevertheless, there are similarities in terms of what they want to convey to the viewer. That you should meditate upon Christ's sacrifice, that you have to have a contemplative relationship with God, that it leads you to a closer relationship, intense spiritual relationship with God.
He shows the halo there.
All these elements here are beautifully conveyed. And another painting that we'll touch on before we proceed on with Spanish paintings from the Romanian collection is this Valerio Castello, St. Francis being consoled by a musical angel. At one point, St. Francis is in great pain. You see the stigmata, of course. He, being the most Christ-like of men, was rewarded by God with the marks of Christ's crucifixion. And we've seen those in several of the paintings by Strozzi here and Castello. And so anyway, he is in pain at one point and asks for consolation. So a musical angel, an angel comes down to play a violin.
Oh, wow.
And he is filled with such rapture that in the near contemporary account of Francis's life called I Fioretti, or the Little Flowers of St. Francis, it's a book on the saint that was written in the 14th, 15th centuries. It says in the account that he is lifted beyond all bodily sense. So he has this rapturous, incredibly ecstatic religious experience. You see how these were to become examples for the faithful who follow later to be like Francis and to have this sort of ecstatic, mystical relationship with God. Julie, we moved to about the same time in Spain now as the works of art from Italy we've been discussing. This is also art of the Counter-Reformation, and this painting is by El Greco. This is the martyrdom of St. Maurice and the Theban Legion.
There's a lot of color in it.
Lots of color, lots of drama, lots of excitement. And El Greco, and you might deduce by his name, was not Spanish. He was called the Greek. He was from Greece, from the island of Crete, and he went to study in Italy, first to Venice and then Rome. So he picks up on a number of the Italian artists that we've been discussing, or that he's contemporary with, and then he goes to Spain, to the city of Toledo, where he works for the rest of his life. And the story goes, here we have St. Maurice, who was a Roman commander, and of course he converted, this is in early Christian times, the Roman Empire, late Roman Empire, and he converts to Christianity and refuses to continue to worship the Roman gods, and he is executed along with his entire legion. Here you see them being
my goodness,
being martyred there in the background, and the heavens open with the celestial glory and come down and present palms of martyrdom to the Roman soldiers that have been that are being executed. So it's very dramatic, but it tells the story. I mean, the story it tells rather is one that is very much concerned with the preservation of the faith and the glories that those that die for the faith attain. So you can imagine how effective, speaking of propaganda, how effective piece of propaganda this was for the church, to promote the church and the saints and the faith. So in fact, we even have a self-portrait of El Greco here in the background, right here on the left-hand side as he looks out towards us. It's actually two portraits, one self-portrait by the artist and then a portrait of Michelangelo, whom you perhaps can see influencing El Greco in the sort of the monumentality and the physicality and the great torsion of these figures. But El Greco, as everyone knows and loves him for, has these wonderful twisted, elongated figures and vibrant colors. There's a different tradition, or I say a further development in Spanish painting, and this is
what a change from what we just looked at.
Exactly, beautifully demonstrated in this painting by Alonso Cano. And Cano came from the town of Seville, which is also hometown to Diego Velázquez. Of course, you know Velázquez as being one of the great painters of Western art. And so the two knew each other, and you can see the art of Velázquez very much resonating in this painting by Cano, which is certainly one of Cano's great masterpieces. It depicts Christ at the column, and that is to say, here, if you can make out this column, he's tied to and waiting to be tortured before he is then led to Golgotha and to be crucified. So it's a scene of cruelty, of tragedy, and yet Cano doesn't show it that way in a sense. Christ is portrayed as this sort of beautiful, almost classically Greek male nude with a great deal of beauty and elegance, and there's a calmness and a quiet to this painting that belies really it's the violence that is about to be enacted in it. As you see this young man bending over to tie together the cord to create the whip with which they'll torture Christ. Notice how wonderfully painted this is, with flecks of light hitting the young man, the fire in the background that burns, the atmospheric, sort of slightly out of focus quality. And that speaks very much to Velázquez and the great innovation he brought to painting. He didn't want to paint, and Cano picks up on this, this trend, this development of the great painter Diego Velázquez. Velázquez didn't want to paint how something should look. He didn't want to paint something as it looked or how we know it looks. In other words, if you're talking about a button or a lace collar, you don't pick out every stitch, you don't paint every detail. It might be the way it looks when you look, you perceive it up close, but it's not how we see it through time and space.
Right.
You know, through atmosphere and light. I mean, these elements mitigate and change the way we perceive. You know, contours blur, colors change, details become irrelevant. And so Velázquez wanted to transcribe onto canvas the way we actually see in life. I mean, that's quite an achievement, quite a revolutionary concept. Then there are paintings from Flanders, present-day Belgium, and this is certainly one of the finest of them. This is by Jan Sanders van Hemessen. This is called The Calling of St. Matthew, and it's where Christ here in the upper right-hand corner calls the publican and tax collector. That is to say, the sinner. I mean, everyone hates a tax collector, you know? So the IRS of its day here, you see Matthew with his bags of coins, you know, taxes just collected, his account books and quill pen and all that. He is and painted with the most incredible detail. Look at the glint on the gold coins and the quill pen, very sharp end of the quill pen. I mean, just great little details here. Matthew is surprised as Christ says, "Come and follow me," as he gestures, and the response is, you know, "Who, me?"
Right. You want me?
Right. Exactly. So von Hemessen here mixes the biblical story with the details of everyday life, once again, in a manner not dissimilar to the Italian painters of the Baroque a few decades later, convincing the viewer of the truth of the event through its depiction in numerous and believable details. Finally, speaking of the humanity of a biblical subject and convincingly rendering it, making it believable and meaningful to our daily experience, is a painting that we'll close with, a painting by Rembrandt. And the story is of Esther and the king of Persia, Ahasuerus' minister, Haman, whom we see here in the lower right-hand corner. The events have transpired, which I'll describe, but he is now begging mercy from Queen Esther. And Esther had been a poor Jewish girl. The Jewish people were in captivity in Babylon, and but she attracted the notice of the king of Ahasuerus, whom we can see with his scepter, sort of rather hard to make out, but I think you can see it, see his figure. At any rate, she had attracted his attention through her great beauty, and he had made her queen, and she, during all this, uncovered the evil plot of Haman to exterminate all the Jews. And she tells the king what's going on. He immediately orders Haman's execution, and here we see Haman begging at the last moment for mercy. He is, though, however, hanged from the gallows, and she is celebrated still to this day in the Feast of Purim, important Jewish holiday, as a savior of the Jewish people. So Rembrandt so simply and decisively renders a story through numerous details as those I just described, which makes him, one of the greatest painters in Western art.
Definitely.
And an
Sure.
appropriate person to end our tour with.
It was beautiful. Thank you so much for giving us a
pleasure.
tour of this. It was great. You know so much about it. I know nothing, but now I do. We thank you for watching Expressions, and we hope you've enjoyed looking at all these beautiful masterpieces. We'll see you next week.